Okay, here's a quick video showing how you would break down one of these FPV watches. So you'll need a fairly small screwdriver. You just take this screw out first, this one on the back. It should come out pretty easy. The next thing you'll need to do, and I think most people kind of get stuck here, is where do you go from here? There are no screws and it doesn't really pry apart easily. What you'll actually want to do is get a pretty small, this is a hex bit, and you want to push it from the back, and it'll sort of start prying up from here. And what you need to do is just take this screen protector off, this little screen lens, and that's going to be trash. And you want to keep pushing up, and what'll happen is it'll start to release, and then it helps if you have a like a flat instrument, like a flat tool. Put it up under there. And what you want to do, there are basically 4 screws here under these corners, and they're holding this black piece of plastic down. That's why you can pull this corner off, because you got the screw from the back. So what you'll need to do is kind of go around, and underneath this white part, you want to try to kind of peel it off. And it'll be, and it's adhered down, so it'll be a little bit tricky, but that should let you get underneath enough to pry it up. You can kind of hear that adhesive coming off. Let me use the screwdriver, it might be easier. This is probably the trickiest part of this whole project, is trying to peel this piece off right here. There it goes. So you want to take this white frame off, and I'll give you a close-up in just a second. And this should peel very carefully all the way up. And you want to be really careful when you're down here in this bottom part, because there's a ribbon cable that's holding the whole thing together. There. Now that that's up, you can kind of set this screen back in this white frame. And now's a good time to check if you broke anything. Just turn it on and you should get that static screen. Yep, so we're still good. And then what you have now are 3 more screws in these other corners. And you want to pull those out. Okay, so here's one. And these 2 down here are the reason why you need to pull this white frame out, because these aren't really accessible through the frame without really bending it up and beating it up. Okay, here's the second one. And the third one is right here in the other corner. And what this will let you do is get the this black frame piece out. So once again, I think this is adhered down a little bit. And the whole board should come out at this point. It should be free. So you should be able to, yeah, there it goes. And then you can push this white frame back down, and then you've sort of removed this back piece, and you have to go and remove these screws from the front after taking this screen lens off. So what you want to do from here, if you're going to break this down further for use for whatever devices you want, it sort of depends on what you're doing, but if you're only doing kind of a basic build where you're going to lose all drone functionality and all you want is the screen itself, then you can just nip off this back piece, nip off the antenna, because we won't be needing it. And then there are a couple ways of doing it. I'll go ahead and use a soldering iron to warm up the solder joint here and remove the battery. And really, we should probably recycle these batteries because they're pretty dangerous. If they short out, they can cause a fire pretty easily. So if you're going to throw these in the trash, which I don't think you should, At least put it in like the case or something where it'll be nice and protected. Kind of wrap it up and make sure it can't short out in the garbage so you start a house fire. Okay, so the next thing, this will sort of peel apart on the back, and the ribbon cable, you can kind of see down in there's that yellowish orangish thing. You'll need to peel this off of this back, and some of these I've had, like this one, is very well adhered, and you just need to really gently pull it off. There you go. So sort of what we'll need to do now, we need to do a few things to make this ready to use for whatever projects. You'll need to remove this USB port because it doesn't fit in a lot of project cases. And then we'll need to remove this receiver. This is a wireless receiver for FPV. And if you're doing the basic build where you're losing the drone connectivity functionality, then this whole board needs to come out. But if you want to keep the functionality, what you would basically need to do is, here there's one pin, the second from bottom, labeled video. And what you would need to do is break that contact, keep everything else soldered, and you'd basically run basically you need to have a wire going from the receiver to a switch, and the output from the switch back to this board. And the third leg of the switch, if you have like a switch like this with 3 prongs with 3 positions and off a left and a right, you'd run the other end to the camera. So you can basically switch between the camera going to the screen or the receiver going to the screen, basically to interrupt it here. But for the basic build where you're losing all the drone functionality, you would need to remove this board. So there's a couple of ways of doing that. If you're good with the heat gun, you can heat up this whole chip and sort of pull it out and remove it pretty easily. There's nothing mechanical holding this on except for these solder joints. But if you're not good with the heat gun, I've seen lots of videos where people use a heat gun and something like this, and they'll heat up around and they'll destroy these resistors. They'll blow up the resistors off the board, and it's a lost cause from there. There's no repairing that easily. Alternatively, you can take a soldering iron and spend time working these joints. And what you'd probably want to do is disconnect this left side first, because there's only these couple of 2 or 3 solder joints, and then work on this side after, because you can bend it from that point. What I've done and what I've had a lot of luck with is literally clipping this side with a pair of side cutters and then flexing this back and forth. Now you run the risk of losing this solder pad, which you're going to need. This second from the bottom video solder pad. If you rip it off, if you do this procedure and you lose the solder pad completely, it's not the end of the world, because there's actually another solder point. Let's see if I can kind of zoom in and show you. It's this kind of second from bottom. I don't know if that's a resistor or a capacitor or what, but it's this right here, that point right there with this bigger one. So you want to take this leg right here, and you can wire your video signal to that leg of that component right there if you lose this solder joint. So I'm going to do that real quick, and I'll solder it together and kind of show you that it works either way. So you can do this one of 2 ways. I've done it both ways, where you literally nip across this board here, because there are no components next to it, or you can kind of take it from this side and break those joints. Just like that. And like I said, you can also do this with the solder sucker manually if you want to. But really, you're just trying to break that joint right there. And then what you can do is kind of gently, now that this is free, flex this back and forth until these solder joints break. And like I said, you're probably going to lose that video solder pad if you do it this way, but it is quicker. We're trying to get this done pretty quickly. So the next thing we'll need to do is sort of clean up some of this stuff. Like we want a nip there. Kind of get it as flat as possible to where it's not going to like puncture anything. Next, let's take our solder and let's see if we lost that joint or not. Let's see if the solder's still sticking to it. Like I said, if not, it's not a huge deal. It's not a deal breaker. Just sort of see what we have going on. Turn my soldering iron up a little bit. Okay. Yeah, it looks like that's sticking just fine. So we can use that point. And like I said, otherwise, if you do this procedure and you lose that solder point, it's no big deal. You just run to this the one that sticks out more right there, sort of in between these two solder joints. You'll want to run to the outer leg right there. So like right, I'm using the Foxer, what is this? Foxer Micro Cat 3 or something. So the yellow is the video, and you would literally run it to that right there, just like that. Otherwise, what we'll need to do is run this video signal to this second joint here, the one that's marked video, right there. So that's one solder point that you'll need. And like I said, on the Foxer, I think it's the Micro Cat 3 or Cat 3 Micro. We have 3, so we'll have this video, and then that's the yellow wire. And then the red wire is for 5 volts, and the black wire is for your ground. And this wire isn't used. So what I typically do, just so it doesn't short on anything, I'll nip off the exposed end on this purple wire. Just like that. Nip off that, the bare metal there. Okay, so we'll need to wire, if you look here, there's a plus and a minus. These are the big solder pads that the battery was wired to. We'll need to wire the red to here and the black to here. And then what we'll need to do after we do that, we have a couple more steps. Let me get this. I'll remove that screw later. Couple more things. We'll need to remove this USB port. And once again, kind of the caveman style is to gently nip it. And once again, it doesn't really matter if we're losing this functionality permanently, because I'm never going to put this back into a watch. You know, this screen's always going to be part of a project. So I don't really care if I'm doing something irreversible. Just kind of nip it and make sure it's sort of flush. Okay. And then the last thing we need to do, it's a little bit tricky. We'll need to run a tiny wire across the back 2 terminals of this button right here. So that's the power button. So what we'll want is this to be shorted out so it thinks that the power button's pressed. When we apply voltage, it'll automatically turn this screen on. So I'll do that. I usually just use a tiny piece of, see where my, here. I usually just use a little piece of wire, a cutoff of a wire. You can use like the leg of a resistor, whatever you have. And you're literally just going to solder it here across these 2 legs. So I'll do it in real time. This is pretty tricky. It sometimes takes a few tries to get it perfect, but you'll need to do that in order to be able to use this for, you know, whatever project you want. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is tin these joints. I don't have a set of helping hands currently, so I just hold this down and add a little bit of solder to each of these 2 joints that we're going to solder across. And the worst part is the you're so close to all these other components. So like I said, this is probably the trickiest part of this whole project, is getting this little wire shorted across these. So let's see, little tweezers. Kind of hold it in place while the solder sets up. It helps to tend the ends of this wire as well, at least one of the ends, because what'll probably happen is you'll need to cut it down. Okay, so that left leg is there. So you'll need to kind of bend it into place now. It's not there all the way, almost there. And what else is annoying is you'll get the left leg done, the left leg all soldered to this tiny bridge piece, this tiny bridging wire, and then you'll go to connect the other side, and it'll come undone from the first side. There's enough heat, even if you're on the other side of this little piece of wire, to melt the solder on the other side. So it's a little bit tricky, but I couldn't think of a better way to do this. I think it's always, this power button's always on. You could remove this power button. That's an option, but I opted not to. I decided just to try to short it across. Okay, so let me zoom in. You can see what I've done is I have that wire. It's kind of ugly, but you have to be careful that it's not touching any other components around there, because there are quite a few. Okay, so what we'll do next is I have, just for testing purposes, I have this plug with the red and black on the end. What I'm going to do is solder the red to the plus and the black to the minus here on the back, and then we can plug it into a power source. We can see if it turns on automatically, and see if we broke any of the other functionality by being kind of rough with it. Let's do that real quick. So the red goes to plus, and the black goes to minus. Okay, so that'll give us power. And then what I have for testing these and for actually running power to these is I just have a cheap, it's like 5,000 milliamp hour. It's like a phone charger. It's a little battery. And I'll show you how to make this cable, but it's basically, you'll take the 5 volts from this USB and run it to the female of this. That way you can plug everything together. So let me plug it in real quick and let's see what happens. And I've had lots of problems with this not connecting. Yeah, so there we go. With the light, it's really flickery. It's not that flickery in real life. But that looks pretty good. So now basically we don't have the signal anymore, and as soon as you unhook it, it turns off. As soon as you plug it in, it'll turn back on, and you're kind of looking just for the screen to show up in black with some text at the top. So what I'll do now is I'll get this little jumper wire soldered in here. We'll plug in the this guy to the other end of that jumper wire, and we'll see if it works. So like I said a couple of times, and I think I'll do this just to show you the fact that it does work, is I'm gonna solder this yellow jumper to this little component here, as opposed to using the solder pad. So let me, kind of the first thing you want to do is, if you're doing this, you want to get as much of the solder off of here as possible. So kind of heat it up, and then you know, use your soldering iron to sort of wick as much of it away as possible. There we go. And then you'll want to heat up, add a little bit of solder to the edge of that component. This is a little finicky. Once again, you run the risk of putting too much heat and ruining the component, you know, kind of pushing it off the board. So let me do that real quick. There we go. So as you can see, I got a nice, real big bead of solder on there. And it's well bonded, it's not gonna brush off. So next thing you have to do is take the yellow wire. And this is gonna be different for different FPV camera manufacturers. And how you'll know is you go here on your actual camera here, and you'll pay attention to how this is plugged in. And then it'll have a video, vid, the middle pin. And on this, the middle pin is that yellow wire. So that's how I know it's the yellow wire. So I'll solder this on real quick. That looks fine for testing. I would definitely trim this exposed part of the wire back if you're going to use this. If you're going through the actual terminal, this 1 second from the bottom, you can probably keep it at its full length. See, and then what we'll need to do is untwist this a tiny bit to get the black and red. A little more length. And there we go. And then we're going to run the back here, the red to the red and the black to the black. This is kind of tricky because you're going to keep desoldering the first wire we did, the power cable. If you can't get it to work, twist these two wires together and then solder them as one wire. That'll probably help a lot. But I'm just going to quickly tack this guy in place. Let's see if I'm gonna have that problem. And it helps too if you have more solder. Actually, let me do that. I'm gonna add a little more solder. The solder is a little bit nicer to work with than the factory solder anyways. Okay, so these two red ones kind of pushing together as much as you can. And tack them in place. That looks pretty okay. Wait for the solder to harden up on you. Then you get the other side. Okay, wait for that to harden up. There we go. You know when it's hardened up because it turns sort of matte instead of a really glossy color. Okay, so now we have everything wired up. We can now plug this in and see if it's working okay. And just be careful the way it plugs in, like this. And what I've learned with this battery, if you tried to, instead of using like a full 5-volt power supply, if you tried to test it with this battery, you know, you basically wire this end into the battery. It doesn't work. There's not enough, I don't know if there's not enough power going through, there's not enough wattage out of a battery like this. You get the voltage you need, but there's not enough power to actually get everything to kick on properly. So let's plug it in again, see what happens. Let's take the cap off the lens. Let's see if we have a video signal. So we don't. So this happens pretty often for me. I'll need to cycle the power twice for some reason. So I just unplugged it and plugged it back in, and there it goes. So that's basically how you're gonna wire together a little camera like this into a screen, sort of from start to finish. Hope this helps, guys.